All right. Hi, everyone. I see a bunch of people filtering in. Thanks so much for your interest in this webinar today on dynamic baselining. Really appreciate everybody showing up. We've got some great discussion planned for today. We'll get started in about a minute. I'm just seeing a lot of people still entering, so we'll give it a bit of time. But as you come in, just so you're aware, we'll kind of have four main sections for the webinar today. We'll kick it off with an intro for our panelists and the subject of dynamic baselining, kind of an overview. And then we'll roll into round robin discussion with our panelists before opening up to some question and answer from you all in the audience. And then we'll wrap it up with some final thoughts and takeaways. So should be a great discussion today. Again, thanks so much for showing up. And yeah, we'll just give it a couple more minutes or a couple more seconds, and then we'll get started. All right. I think we're set to go. I'll go ahead and hand it over to our moderator today, Nan Pond, to kick us off.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this exciting conversation. As Catherine said, I will be moderating today's discussion. My name is Nan Pond. I'm the Vice President for Nature-Based Research and Monitoring at a company called Rubicon Carbon. Joined today by an amazing panel. We have Elias Ayrey, the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of Renoster, today's webinar hosts. Christine Cadigan, the Executive VP of Carbon Origination from the American Forest Foundation, and Carlos Silva, who's a remote sensing scientist and carbon market policy leader at Pachama. So as we dive into today's discussion on dynamic baselining, I think it probably behooves us to start by defining what dynamic baselining is. And so I offer the following definition. Dynamic baselines provide a data-based estimation of variation in trends and changes through time and/or space, forming the basis of comparison for an intervention's climate impact. If you disagree with this baseline definition, I would encourage you to drop into the Q&A or the chat feature, tweaks that you think should be there, other changes. One of the challenges and really exciting parts of this conversation is that dynamic baselines can mean a lot of different things to different people. They can mean different things to the people who are calculating them. They can mean different things to people who are interpreting them. And this means that we really need to make sure that we are using shared vocabulary and shared definitions as we're talking through the impacts of dynamic baselines, the implications of dynamic baselines. What we see right now in 2024 in the voluntary carbon market space is that there are huge variations in dynamic baselining in what is prescribed in different methodologies, what's being used by scientists and project developers, and the way that dynamic baselines are implemented across a range of carbon project types. If we think about where the concepts that we see right now in dynamic baselining originated, a lot of this came out of first some peer-reviewed studies, and then I think somewhat concurrently research being done at organizations that weren't publicly sharing their processes, but were publicly sharing the application and results of what they were doing. So we see there are peer-reviewed studies that make use of dynamic baselines. There are different ratings agencies, such as Renoster and others in the space, that have developed their own approaches to dynamic baselining to evaluate the impact of different carbon projects. We see project developers that have used different forms of dynamic baselines, and more recently, developers that are sort of developing their own unique approaches to use to try to quantify the impact of their projects. There's carbon credit brokers. I would include sort of Pachama in that category, as well as Rubicon Carbon, my employer, who have developed their own internal ways to apply a dynamic baseline to further assess or restate the climate impact of a project. And then in the last year, we've seen several innovations in published, approved carbon methodologies that are now requiring different types of dynamic baselines. ACR's 2.1 methodology for IFM, VM45 under Vera, also using a dynamic baseline for IFM projects. On the ARR side, VM47 from Vera, and ERS's first methodology is making use of remote sensing-backed dynamic baselines as well. What we don't have right now are dynamic baselines that are part of methodological requirements for RED+ projects. Nevertheless, I think a lot of people come into this conversation thinking Dynamic baselines, those are those things we're using to check whether REDD+ projects are any good. So it's important to realize there's a really big tent here in terms of what these definitions are, and when and where dynamic baselines are being brought in can vary widely. So having said that, right, what are the strengths of dynamic baselines? Our panelists are going to provide a lot more perspective and context that really digs into some of these nuances. But at a high level, dynamic baselines provide a data-backed counterfactual estimate, defining either past trends leading up to a particular point in time, or trends that are concurrent with or being like actively realized across a landscape and used to compare against a project. Dynamic baselines, by nature of being dynamic across time, can be regularly updated to reflect real-world changing conditions. And they also provide a much more statistically robust way to quantify the uncertainty in a given counterfactual. Because a dynamic baselining approach typically produces a range of possibilities, that range gives us a measure of uncertainty around what we're defining as the counterfactual. And I know Carlos will share a lot later about how Pachama is thinking about that problem and the benefits of uncertainty quantification. But again, there are a lot of variations in how we see dynamic baselines being used. So listen for these differences coming from our speakers, and we will do our best to sort of highlight which particular piece we're talking about during the conversation. Some dynamic baselines are used to evaluate trends from the past up to a point in time and then become predictive. Somebody put into the chat here, aren't dynamic baselines ex post? Some of them are. Some of the ways that we see ex post evaluation coming in is sort of a real-time calculation of dynamic baselines, what's happening across the landscape compared to what's happening right now. We see dynamic baselines that are being required under different methodologies. And we also see dynamic baselines being used as a tool for independent evaluation. Not all dynamic baselines make use of remotely sensed data. Some do, and some do it really powerfully. But there's also ways to perform statistical analysis that makes use of pooled data without actually using remote sensing data. And those are also something that we're considering a dynamic baseline. And finally, the scale of comparison. Those of us who like to geek out about how to form a really good dynamic baseline can go really far into, are we pixel matching? Are we parcel matching? Are we clustering? And so that scale does really matter and varies depending on who's implementing the process. I'm going to go through a couple of visuals now. Personally, when I try to wrap my head around what are we talking about when we're making a dynamic baseline, the pictures really help. And so there's a few slides here. These are being very graciously shared by Carlos from Pachama. So this is a little bit of a walkthrough of the approach that Pachama is using in dynamic baselining, looking at tropical forest conservation efforts. So to start, right, we all understand that a baseline represents the business as usual, the counterfactual of what would have happened in the absence of a carbon project coming in and changing something. To understand what the landscape looked like originally, some parties, like Pachama in this example, and Catherine, can you go to the next slide, are using remotely sensed monitoring approaches, right? So satellite data perhaps is dynamically observing day in and day out on some regular cadence what's happening within a project area and its surroundings over time. And then what we see is an approach to match that area to other places across the landscape, define the similarities between each of those circles and this project area, and then use that to form the basis of trends and change over time, maybe in the past leading up to project start, or once the project began, what happened across the landscape and what happened in the project area. Because there are a bunch of different circles there, that produces a number of different estimates or observations of what's happened across time. And so on this next slide here, we see that the trends of what's happening across the landscape aren't a single solid value, but there actually is an uncertainty range that can be calculated because you can see the trend in each individual point on the ground that's being used as a comparison. And that produces a confidence band around emissions in these controlled areas compared to what's observed across any given project. Catherine, can you go to the next slide? Right. And so in typical accounting, right, project's climate impact is the difference between the project and the control areas, those two solid lines. But the use of the dynamic baseline allows us to better understand how sure we are about the gap between those two because of the quantification of uncertainty. Another example of how dynamic baselines are getting implemented right now in active carbon projects is through IFM approaches that are making use of paired observational plots. So this is a graphic coming from American Forest Foundation's Family Forest Carbon Program, which Christine is going to share more about in a little bit here. This is a visualization of the approach used in VM45, where the control areas are defined not through remote sensing or any kind of spectral analysis, but through filtering and subsetting key attributes within the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis data set, which provides a comprehensive set of data looking across the landscape of North American forests and what's happening over time there. So just as dynamic, right? FIA plots are measured every 5 years or every 10 years. And so we get an updated snapshot year over year of a large area, but without making use of remote sensing data as a requirement for these kinds of projects. So with these different visuals in mind, we're gonna turn our attention to the conversation that we have planned here. And I'm gonna ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and then share a little bit about how dynamic baseline is used in your particular work context, what the definition of that is when you're thinking about it, and how that's accelerated the work that you're doing. So Elias, can we start with you, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. My name's Elias. So my background is in forest science and remote sensing. I'm co-founder here at Renoster and also chief science officer. And Renoster is, of course, a carbon ratings agency. So we use dynamic baselines to review carbon projects. And what we do is we typically compare baselines that we've created to baselines that projects are proposing to see whether or not they match. We typically consider our baseline process to be partially dynamic and partially static. And what I mean by that is we typically compare project outcomes for the duration of the project. So if it's a 10-year-old project, we look at what's happened in the last 10 years and look at observations each year to see what's happening each of those years. But then we do feel we also have to kind of predict what may happen in the future. And we consider that to be the static elements of our baseline because making future observations from past experiences obviously is more speculative. Our baseline works by matching, fairly similar to what we described for Pachama's baseline. So we have a set of variables that we typically match to using remote sensing. We put them into 5 categories: disturbance history, biota, so that may be like forest cover and height, accessibility, so light pollution, distance to urban areas, topography, and bioclimatic variables. So bioclimatic being, what's the mean annual temperature and is there a lot of seasonality? I think, yeah, we compute uncertainty estimates in this very similar way, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But there's a couple things that excite me about dynamic baselines, and one of the things that really excites me is that I think a lot of the times shifts the narrative from what could have taken place to what likely would have taken place. And I think this is important because a lot of historic baselines from methodologies 10, 15 years ago, they're based on what you could have done. So you could have cut down all the trees under the law. You could have done this or that. They're often based on kind of simulation. So I'm simulating that I'm going to cut all these trees down. But dynamic baselines are based on observations. So in 2018, if you're thinking the trees are going to get cut down, you observe other trees and see if they're actually cut down. And so it's a much more statistically sound technique because it factors into account all these kind of hidden variables that we can't take into account otherwise, like would they have cut like is it financially viable to access these trees? Is there a really steep slope on the site? Is there mill capacity? All of these things actually go into whether or not the trees were really at risk. So that's one of the reasons that we really do like using dynamic baselines like this. One more quick point is that dynamic baselines are great, but they're not everything. So we still have to assess other elements of these projects. We still have to assess other elements of additionality too. So a dynamic baseline is really good, but we still have to assess whether or not the forest was at risk in general. So there are some IFM projects taking place on land that's been conserved for 100+ years. A dynamic baseline could be run on that land, and maybe it would forecast that there would be some losses. But we know, as humans, that if there's already a conservation easement on the land that's 100 years old, it's probably not at risk. And so we do have to kind of couple dynamic baselines with some other factors as well when we evaluate these projects. So I'll pass that torch.
Thanks, Elias. Carlos, can you share a little bit about Pachama's approach and how dynamic baselining informs your work?
Yeah, my name is Carlos Silva. I'm the lead of R&D science at Pachama, and I start by saying Pachama's real overall mission is to try to scale forest conservation via the carbon market to have a climate relevant impact. And so our real overarching objective is how can we get the market to a place of high integrity as well as transparency and scalability. And so to the extent we are using dynamic baselines, we are trying to get to a world where crediting is stable across, for a given project, across registry, across analysts, et cetera. The market can't continue to operate in a world where for project X, if we give it to Elias or to Nan or to Christine or to myself, that we get widely divergent answers, and we might all be using dynamic baselines. So I think that Nan really did a nice job of opening up about some of the variation that exists. And so, as we'll talk about later, we're really focused on how can we find convergence to the extent there are divergence among approaches, understand why that is. There could be answers that are more right, or let's say correct or wrong. And so I'll just kind of, you asked particularly about how we're using them. Pachama's really seeking to, in that notion of enhancing its transparency and scaling, is to allow the project developer to do the good work that they do on the ground, whether that be planting trees in the case of reforestation or actively engaged on the ground in conservation, and to make the kind of calculations that are required for crediting something that can be done at scale with reproducibility and not be this sort of cumbersome, tedious thing that it requires, all the people in this, panel, for example, to wade through documents of hundreds of pages. We want to be in a world where we can have, with quick, simple validation, high confidence that the baseline that is being computed for a project is a baseline that will withstand scrutiny through time. So yeah, I'll leave it with that. We can dive into more detail going forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Christine, you're coming into the panel with a bit of a different perspective, representing a project developer who's implementing projects right now, making use of dynamic baselining approaches. Can you share a little bit about that perspective and what you've seen so far?
Yeah, thank you, Nan. First of all, just to introduce myself again, I'm Christine Cadigan. I work for the American Forest Foundation. For those of you who may not be familiar with AFF, we're a national forest conservation organization, and we specifically work with and through small family landowners for meaningful conservation outcomes. And what we're strategically focused on now is climate mitigation. So putting these forests to work as a climate mitigation tool. So as Nan suggested, we are currently operating as a project developer. We are operating and administering the Family Forest Carbon Program. And as a mission-driven organization, we really are committed to the integrity of the claims that we're making. We're in this truly for the conservation outcome, this climate mitigation outcome. But we also had, in building and developing this program, had another mission, given that this is the sole focus of the organization, and really ensuring that we were providing more inclusive opportunities for forests across the U.S., and in particular for the 40% of forests that are owned by small family landowners. So these really were the two lenses that we were looking at: is how do we bring more landowners, more forests into the fold so that we can put them to work, and also how do we ensure that we have really high integrity, high quality claims. We worked in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Terra Carbon to validate the M45. I know Nan referenced that at the top of the webinar here. And in creating this and validating this new methodology through Vera, we were trying to, again, increase the rigor of our claims by incorporating this dynamic baseline carbon accounting approach, and also, again, provide more inclusive opportunities. So no longer required are these repeated, expensive, and intensive inventories that really weren't scalable, particularly when you're working with this small landowner audience. So I would say we are in this right now. We're implementing this program across the Northeast, the Midwest, and now into the Southeast this year. We're going through our first verification using BM45 right now. And what I can say, we haven't yet finished that verification, so we hope to issue credits by the end of the year. But what I can say is we have actually seen impact using the dynamic baseline. So it is possible. We're really excited, looking forward to this first issuance. And you know, some of the things that are coming up most through our audit, through this verification event, are really around like boundary clarifications, things like that, like other programmatic adjustments. And really, we're not seeing issues with the use of the carbon accounting at all. So I just introduced that from a project developer's perspective, that this is possible, it's doable, and we're looking forward to issuing those credits hopefully by the end of the year.
That's great. Exciting to see, dynamic baselines actually at work across the landscape. And we'll, further in the conversation, we'll dig into some of the challenges and lessons learned there. But first, as we've seen, right, everyone that's part of this panel is making use of a slightly different approach to dynamic baselining because of the context, because of the team that's developed the work. And I think that, there's a real call or a real need within the market to try to standardize our approaches, to not have every different company reinventing a wheel, but rather to somehow gain more consistency and have consistent replicable results coming from our analyses. Carlos, can you share a couple thoughts about, the leadership Pachama is bringing in this space and what you want to see next?
Yeah, sure. And Catherine, if you could show my slides, I might make these points. I think as I mentioned at the outset here about our focus on ensuring, for quality also implies standardization is what I was getting at earlier. If there is a true climate impact, that impact must be estimated consistently. Go to the next slide, Catherine. And this is just to give you an example here. So I think, Elias was talking about some of the data sets, for example, that he uses on matching. And the question is, which data sets might you use to compute a dynamic baseline, or which features, and then which, if you say you care about a particular feature, which satellite or which data set will you use for that feature? Nan mentioned, are you matching at the pixel level, or are you matching sort of contiguous polygons using a synthetic control method? And so one of the things I just show here, so just to orient you on the right, this is just for an actual red project. The green line is the project, the deforestation of the project. So the y-axis is cumulative deforestation over time. And then all you see is KNN is Pachama's control area selection using K nearest neighbors at the pixel level. The synthetic control is using if you followed some of the literature in Talia's West, using the exact same input feature set, but computing using a synthetic control method. And then what I've called here a null baseline is just say, what if we just drew a buffer around the project at 10 kilometers, 25, 50 kilometers, et cetera. And you see widely different, what would be the baselines if we selected any of these. And so the question here is we need some way to say, an arbiter of simply filtering through this. We can't have a case where one developer is using one and another using another. And so if you go to the next slide, Catherine, and this is what Nan was showing it earlier when we mentioned these pseudo projects. And so this is a simple way by where agnostic to any approach. So we can evaluate any approach, whether it be the synthetic control, pixel level matching, different input features you might use or might think are important or not. And we can then, with these pseudo projects, which is, as Nan mentioned earlier, are simply randomly selected areas on the landscape, we can compute a control area for each of those pseudo projects. And then we can look on a year by year basis, what was the outcome in the pseudo project and its matching control. And if we have a perfect baseline algorithm, obviously these points would lie up on the 1-to-1, 45-degree line. The control area outcomes, deforestation, would perfectly match the deforestation observed in the pseudo project. And so it's just one example to show you. On the left is one of those 50-kilometer buffers. So what is called this, let's just draw a circle around the project. On the right is actually using our pixel level matching. And you can see that's better, so that you get tighter fit and less bias as you see those sort of points on the left are spread upwards. So this can be run for any, the important one is if you can imagine a world, and I think Elias will talk about this as well, where an independent entity that held, for example, pseudo projects, as long as any project developer or any sort of market actor can reproducibly compute the baseline for these pseudo projects, you can produce these sorts of charts to get a sense of what's going on. Next slide, I just wanted to, only two more here, I don't want to go on too long here. Nan asked us earlier on also to make a kind of distinctions here among what would be avoided deforestation, for example, versus improved forest management, IFM, and reforestation. Reforestation is actually a much simpler problem. This is just showing you here now pseudo projects using a canopy height map, Pachama's canopy height map, matching at the pixel level as well. And the real take-home message here is that you're going to see some noise on the order, let's say, of a meter or so in terms of the change observed in a pseudo project relative to its control area. That also will improve over time with better canopy height maps. But I think the point here is that for baselines and reforestation, the real issue is how good is your canopy height map or your carbon index that you're observing in your control area, as opposed to how accurately can you select a control area. What I mean by that is once you've selected a control area, presumably if you're reforesting, you're starting from very low carbon stocks, both in your project and your control area. And so the question is, how well are you able to quantify if there are some small reforestation, background reforestation you're observing in your control area, how accurately can you measure those small gains? But the control area selection is less you get less spread as you saw in the case of wood deforestation. And that's, I'll just kind of close here with this next slide, is to just show you an example again of again a simple project, but you can the light blue is a case of Pachama's pixel level control area selection, and that spread that you see, the buffered area around it, is our uncertainty. So that range of variability across pseudo projects, and you can see on the left case where you've got quite high spread. I mean, that's not quite satisfying. We're talking about cumulative, let's say in 2022 of either 5,000, maybe a median estimate around 15,000, but getting up to 25,000. When you're talking about errors over 50%. And so on the right, you see an example of much lower uncertainty. And so the point here is that we're really working hard to try to compress those errors, but issuance, our kind of high level point is issuance needs to take account of uncertainty, because if you don't adequately measure uncertainty, you don't know, any single estimate you might present for baseline, how actually stable it is, how much confidence you have in it, and those errors can be large. Anyway, so I'll close with that. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Yeah. Thanks, Carlos. Right, and I think one thing that is obvious is that it's not that the older versions of static baselines were without error, right? It's that we can quantify uncertainty, and now we're actually confronting it because we have tools to work with uncertainty and understand how to quantify it and account for it in accounting within projects. Elias, what's your thought on this? How do we start to standardize and push the market forward?
Well, I completely agree with everything Carlos said. I find it very unlikely that the market is going to kind of agree on the best way of doing things. We all obviously have our own approaches. We could envision an actor like Vera just making the rules and putting the rules in stone. But I think that even under that scenario, we're still going to end up with like a new satellite being launched and kind of that obsoleting the rules, in a year later. So really, I think the framework that might work the best is we do all have these different methodologies, and some of them maybe work better than others in certain situations. What we should maybe be aiming for is a method of verification of these methodologies that works. And that's just like the synthetic controls. And so what I would maybe propose is, instead of Vera saying, like, you have to do matching based on these principles and these criteria, and you have to use this satellite, maybe instead they could say, here are the synthetic controls, you have to do matching over them, and you have to demonstrate that they're this accurate. And that way we can demonstrate accuracy. And as time goes on and we put a new satellite in orbit, accuracy will get better and better. And everyone's baselines will get better and better as well. I'm a big nerd, and one field in which this is kind of similar is machine learning. And if you look to machine learning, they do exactly like this in kind of their attempts at creating better and better models. And so, for example, Kaggle is a machine learning competition in which they kind of put out these data sets where you can create models and try to see how good those models are at predicting on those data sets. And they're standardized. And whoever creates the best model, no matter what the methodology happens to be, they're the winners. And so that's kind of a competitive environment that incentivizes the best type of baselines. And we can all kind of use our own approaches. Yeah, I mean, I think that the key to this is someone putting out a global data set that we can all kind of agree upon as a method of validating against. And maybe that's Pachama, maybe it's Vera. I think it's not infeasible for us to imagine a global data set being created for a fairly low cost that we can all kind of assess our accuracies against. But it is also worth acknowledging that there are different project types. So Pachama's approach is very geared towards reforestation and avoided deforestation, and the American Forest Foundation is very geared towards improved forest management. So we probably do need to recognize those subtleties as well as we go forward.
Thanks, Elias. Christine, I'm sure that from the perspective that you're bringing, right, you're acutely aware of the tension between innovation and sort of buyers having comfort in the market. So how do you see standardization playing a role in sort of shoring up what we see in the BCM today?
Yeah, I appreciate the definition that you introduced at the outset, Nan, and some of the comments that both Elias and Carlos introduced. And I think I would just reiterate again the need for standardization. And yes, I agree that we need some flexibility for implementing these methodologies in various use cases. But I would argue that we have too much flexibility right now. And what you're seeing is maybe when buyers are looking at or when they're trying to understand how these methodologies are being operationalized, one instance of dynamic baseline or so-called dynamic baseline may not necessarily equal, the same thing in another instance. So I would argue that we do need to converge on maybe a little bit more specific definition. I agree with the definition that you provided, Nan, and I think we can get a little bit more specific as a community. Some of that's the role of the standard bodies, certainly, to help contribute to that. But it also is this kind of community of experts that we have here today, and certainly many of the folks that are watching the webinar to contribute to what that actually means. And then we can create this market transparency. From our perspective, how we would more specifically define a dynamic baseline is one that's derived from standardized, independent, and importantly, transparent data. So I really do appreciate your introduction there, Elias, that we would love to ultimately get to this globally available data set. We also think that dynamic baselines should use matches that are incorporating all of the relevant data and really trying to minimize adverse selection, that they're frequently updated so that they're addressing some of these trends or events that really might affect the production in any given place. And last but certainly not least, also assessing this additionality ex post so that we're not taking credit for something that we haven't yet observed. So anyways, just suggesting that is our organization's definition of dynamic baseline. I don't know that it's probably widely agreed upon. And that's where the conversation needs to happen, is what does it actually mean? Can we get more specific so that we can introduce this market transparency?
Foresters love to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And certainly if we can't define it, we're not going to be able to standardize it. So we've talked a lot about the potential of dynamic baselines and how we're actually making use of them. But they're not without their own challenges, right? So first thinking about what are some of the technological challenges and methodological challenges that we see in implementing dynamic baseline. Christine, you've mentioned some of the things that are of utmost importance for your program, but can you share a little bit more about, the challenges and then, the ways that you've overcome them?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind here, Nan. Thanks for the question. So one, when it relates to the kind of technical use of our methodology in particular and dynamic baselines, it can be limiting when we're looking at specific forest types or even specific management scenarios that we want to address, because obviously you have to have enough data in order to develop this really robust match so that you have a high degree of confidence that you can really develop this counterfactual that you can compare your intervention with. And so there are, particularly in the US context, right, there's a couple of forest types that we can't quite identify a practice or an opportunity because there isn't enough data to develop this robust match. And even within forest types that are more extensive and you would think that you would have enough data to operate in, there's different management scenarios. Like if we're trying to address competing vegetation after a harvest, right? There's like a very specific forest several stage that you're looking for within the data to match, and it's just not there, or the data isn't robust enough, isn't available enough to create those high quality matches. So I'd say that's one of the limiting factors, and I'm hopeful that, you know, together we can overcome that. But it is disappointing that we're not yet able to offer opportunities in all of these places where we know that there would actually be a meaningful carbon benefit. The other thing that we're, I might be opening a can of worms here, Nan, so I can just, maybe we can come back to it.
We love the cans of worms. Open it up.
Okay. But there's obviously operational challenges associated with implementing these practices. So specifically as it relates to financing. So I just wanted to, maybe that's the can of worms that folks are probably most curious about. But in these under these dynamic baseline scenarios, especially when, you know, you're operating ex post, you're not actually issuing credits, and there's some uncertainty about what those credit production levels may be, and it's tricky to finance that, right? When you don't know for certain what exactly you're going to produce, what vintages and volumes in any, you know, in any given year over a specific timeline. So we've definitely run into challenges as a project developer in financing that. But what I would say is that what we're doing, and I think Elias, you mentioned this before, is yes, there was uncertainty in some of the previous methods of carbon accounting. We're actually identifying that uncertainty, and we're more able to quantify that with a dynamic baseline. And what we're finding actually, or what I would posit that we're finding, is that under some of these traditional kind of modeled baseline approaches, the uncertainty was sitting in the atmosphere, right? So the atmosphere was what was holding the risk. And I think we can all agree that if we really want to make, or if we really want to ensure that this collective effort is making a difference with climate mitigation, that we can ill afford for the atmosphere to continue to hold that risk. So we've got to figure out how we displace that risk through some combination of project developers, maybe landowners. That's a tricky thing for the landowners that we work with, because they're small individual landowners, but perhaps some landowners would be willing to hold some of that risk. And then last but not least is buyers and investors. And I would introduce here that I think there is more room for buyers and investors to actually step up and hold some of that risk, because it is untenable to expect that project developers could do this alone. So kind of a suite of issues that I just introduced, Nan. It's by no means perfect or smooth sailing, but I think all of these things can be solved if we work together.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I do think it's a really important thing to talk about, right? That we see a great deal of statistical promise in what dynamic baselining can bring in terms of really understanding the climate impact of different interventions. But to your point, right, someone has to hold that risk. And, you know, no one wants to, frankly, right? It's a challenging thing. And one of the common criticisms of dynamic baselining, and I think particularly salient in a REDD+ context, but of course also applicable in some reforestation efforts and the, you know, family forest landowners that the FFCP works with, is figuring out how to bring in the statistical rigor of a dynamic baseline, but also make sure that the other stakeholders, those people who are actually making their own changes, right, the people on the ground who are shifting their behavior, aren't the ones bearing the brunt of that risk. Elias, I know you have some thoughts about this. Do you want to add something to that discussion?
Yeah, if we're moving on to risk, I guess my feeling is I guess in terms of assuring people what future credits are going to be, or in terms of computing ex ante credits, we've had fairly good success using static baselines that are kind of similar to dynamic baselines that maybe draw matches from historical analogs. And we can get pretty close to estimating what our dynamic baseline is going to forecast. So I would still encourage investors to often use this as a means of predicting how much deforestation is going to happen, or what their future baseline is going to be. Yeah, I think that we can also kind of draw analogs from other maybe sectors. I mean, up until now, carbon issuance has been fairly well assured. So you can go into a project knowing exactly how many credits you're going to get each year. Dynamic baselines, of course, do change that, although you can make forecasts, of course. But if we look at other like commodities markets, like agricultural markets or oil markets, they already have that uncertainty built in. So you don't really know how much corn you're going to grow in a particular year. You have a pretty good estimate, but you don't actually have the true value. So I do think that investors are kind of, in a sense, familiar with kind of working around these uncertainties in what they're doing there. If we can go back to the technological barriers bit real quick, I do think there are some barriers, and I think one of the biggest barriers is that like the implication of dynamic baselining is that you need a gaggle of scientists on your team, even if you're the best tree planting group in the world, and that's tricky. So I hope that we get some maybe third-party software solutions that make it easier for smaller players to implement dynamic baselines. But we've also come across some technological problems with dynamic baselines, and one of them is exactly what Christine touched on, which is that sometimes there aren't enough matches. And so internally we often call this the last tree standing problem. If you've got like one little protected forest and it's been clear cut all around, then you're not really going to be able to create a great dynamic baseline from that. Our solution has been usually to like look further abroad, but that obviously widens the confidence intervals and doesn't really tell us as much as we could learn by, looking closer. And then I think the other technological problem is that we're constantly evolving in the kind of ways that we want to do this. So we're constantly wanting to add new variables. I really like AFF and VM45's matching criteria and how they create matches based on these FIA plots. But I'm always like, what if we included this? Like, what if we included land value in addition to all these other things that we're matching? And I think that's really going to be tempting. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why that there's so much divergence in definitions here. Carlos, do you have any other methodological challenges on Pachama's side?
No, I think both of what you guys said or a number of things I would say exactly. I appreciate Elias' point on the financial risk. I think because the market doesn't have confidence in the actual underlying asset itself, that's why all these other sort of financial instruments that exist for, let's say, like corn futures and other things like that, Elias pointed out. So I think it's an eminently solvable problem if we solve the confidence in the asset itself. I'm glad Elias mentioned the last standing forest or tree. I think there is some also accounting, complexity that involves with, you obviously can't have control areas overlapping for same projects, and the control, in a particular area of the world, these can get a bit crowded. And so there are some sort of methodological or accounting challenges as one moves forward. I want on the note of smaller players and what Elias was saying, I think I still see a world, and this also gets to what Elias was saying a moment ago about constant evolution, and that whether it be new data sets, let alone like new machine learning methods or understanding of problems that might evolve, how we compute a dynamic baseline. I think that's still why we need what would be, I would call generically, sort of output-based validation, as opposed to what we have today, which is an input-based validation. What I mean by that is currently we have a world where an entity like Vera will specify a recipe, do these things, and that as long as you do these things, you have complied with the methodology and you're good to go. And I think what the point is, what we need is we saw the pseudo project uncertainty, where we're sort of agnostic on, and we allow the system to evolve. If new satellites come online, if new machine learning methods or understanding allows us, we can not have to change the rules. We can just reevaluate against pseudo projects. But that then requires, I think what Elias was also alluding to, is that the crediting rules at the moment would somehow account for that uncertainty. And what I mean by that at the simplest is, do you credit against the mean when we saw, or the central estimate when we saw those earlier figures of the separation between the project and the baseline? Take those two lines, or do we say, no, actually we want to take the lower bound, and then as you compress that, we can imagine a buffer pool that we can pull from as we just have these technological improvements that might shift crediting, as opposed to unforeseeable climate risk, for example, that we normally think of a buffer pool and fire risk. So and I think all of that, and this I'll close now on that smaller player piece, I think all of that to some degree implies less a model whereby the registry farms out or subcontracts all of this calculation to project developers, and more of a centralized bit where you've got sort of routine algorithmic calculation. It doesn't have to be a single, obviously, monopolistic entity, but fewer players that were getting higher confidence in their outputs, having the ability to regularly validate those outputs, and those then being used such that small players don't have to have this sort of scientific team or pay a lot of money for middlemen, consultants to do that sort of work, but it can be done. So yeah, I'll stop. Sorry.
So yeah, I mean, I think what you're sharing calls to mind for me, like the model that the ecosystem restoration standard is bringing, right? Where the standard registry itself is the one that's doing those calculations, and the project developers are focused on the ground operations. As we're talking about some of these technological challenges, I want to highlight a couple of the questions that we're getting in the audience Q&A feature. I'm also noting there's some really exciting audience-led conversation happening there. It's great to see people sort of diving in and engaging with one another, and doing so very respectfully as well. But one question that I'm seeing in a couple different places is sort of the limitations of the kinds of passive sensor data that are being used with remote sensing based dynamic baselining. Whether this is, the inability to see sort of single tree selection operations, or degradation as opposed to deforestation trends. So I'm going to offer sort of two questions, and anybody who wants to sort of jump into with one of the responses. First, have we seen any application of LiDAR in dynamic baselining, or is there an interest in that? And secondly, what do you see as the possibility to bring remote sensing based dynamic baselining into something like an IFM context, given the limitations of the sensors?
So for what it's worth, our matches fall upon the Jedi points, but I won't pretend that Jedi is able to detect very subtle degradation either. Yeah, I think we've done some experimenting with doing baseline matching with LiDAR, but it's very limited to the United States. And one of the problems is the dynamic element, of course, is that you want to kind of follow it year by year, and we don't have LiDAR acquisitions flown every year. So we can maybe do an initial set of matching based on maybe a partially degraded state in the beginning to find our matches, but following outcomes is still kind of left to passive sensors. And so maybe this does speak to why field plots like the M45 and American Forest Foundation are superior in some of these forest types where forestry is a little bit more subtle.
Carlos, Christine, anything to add there?
I was just going to add that we haven't internally at Pachama been doing yet much on IFM. Not that we're not interested. I think what along the lines of when we would do it is we wouldn't necessarily use direct LiDAR, but what we would think about is the notion of stand age, and Elias mentioned sort of time since disturbance, but we could at least be matching on a canopy height map through time. So we'd have a time series, and of course there are uncertainties in that, but we'd have some notion of where a stand is in its cycle, and that such that the control area, the age distribution or stand distribution of the control area would match that we have in the project. And then on the ability to detect small scale degradation, that's always an issue. And I think obviously if it's missed in the control, you're obviously underestimating the baseline. But there are probably, obviously I think I often think of this internally pushed sort of two notions or principles of crediting. If you use only quantities against which you can have independent data sets for validation, if you don't have such independent data sets, try to use consistent sort of conservative and uniform defaults so that everyone's accepting the same and you don't have any gaming involved there. So there are obviously ways that one can at least ensure consistency in estimates, even if we don't have observable, like the ideal observable information.
Just a couple of quick thoughts, Nan. I would say in our work, we are constantly looking and testing at the latest data sets that might be available in a North American IFM context. And what we're finding still is that the ground data, the FIA plots, for example, are most representative of what's going on the ground, just like Elias said. It's absolutely room for improvement, and we continue to stay on top of that and hope that we can incorporate those data sets as they become available. One other thing, just to pick up on what Carlos said about, in the absence of the perfect data set, relying on some of these conservative estimates. One other thing that we're finding with FIA 2 is that it likely does represent a fairly conservative data set, particularly with their non-response rate, right? So those landowners, for small landowners, there's a decent denied access rate where they don't actually let these folks on their property to collect the data. And in most cases, that is likely to correlate with those who are most heavily managing their property, maybe not wanting to see some of the activity ongoing. So we do find that, or we do suspect that this data set does represent a fairly conservative estimate of what's actually going on the landscape, and therefore protecting against some overcrediting.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question that I think is related both to some of the AFF use of FIA data, but then also the remote sensing piece. So again, anybody that wants to jump in on this is, to what extent does making use of dynamic baselines require someone to understand the land tenure history of a given point on the ground to infer results? Any thoughts there?
I just said, this relates to one of the prior questions about sort of technological challenges, and I think Christine was alluding to this as well, is that obviously we need geospatial data sets for any of these type of more qualitative policy or things like land tenure. To the extent, those are obviously more available in some parts of the world than others. And so I think that's, some notion, if you lack that, that will appear in noise when you do validation pseudo projects, so you can capture that to some degree. But if there are like major, I'll give you an example, in Brazil, for example, there are, even on privately held land, certain conservation categories that are required by the law. And so if we have, for example, a reforestation project that's located on one of these privately held but legal reserves, we obviously want to be selecting control areas similarly with that same land tenure status. So in Brazil, there are some, those data sets are improving on like land tenure, but they're not necessarily perfect. And in other parts of the world, they're not necessarily even available at all. And so anyway, I think it highlights the importance, obviously, of doing the validation in pseudo projects, so you can at least capture, presumably, the increase in noise in your estimates from that. But it'd be preferable to obviously have those layers.
Yeah, no, and I think, thank you, Carlos, for pushing us out of North America, right? I think it's easy to get focused on what we can do with the FIA data set in the United States, for example, but that's like the global leader in a national forest inventory. And so really, understanding how are the lessons that we're sort of learning and the things that are being tested in areas where we have extremely precise and regularly updated data sets. What's the lowest common denominator we can distill those things down into to be able to implement rigorous dynamic baselines in other contexts? At this point, thank you so much to everyone who's putting in questions. I honestly, many of the people in the panel, or not in the panel, in the audience Q&A, you guys are answering your own questions, which is, again, just fantastic to see. It's like an entire community has sprung up in the side of this webinar. But I want to turn the conversation back to the panelists to sort of wrap up with some closing thoughts. So as we've talked about the challenges, the limitations, the potentials for dynamic baselining, what do you want to communicate out into the broader market about the strengths of these approaches? And then what next steps and innovations are you most excited to be pushing forward? Elias, I'm going to end with you so that you can wrap up from the Renoster standpoint. So Carlos, why don't you take the first response here?
Yeah, I think I'd say that the market's taken a fantastic step toward some of these more rigorous data-driven approaches for baselines, and I think that's something that should be celebrated. And I think we're now in a phase where how do we implement those in a way that is not inordinately complex and just continues to transmit uncertainty to buyers and the general public? And so I think the most important priority is to figure out how, whether policy needs to change around accrediting. Obviously, at the moment, the uncertainty is not really required by a number of registries. How can that be codified in a way, as I was saying earlier, that's agnostic, perhaps to methodologies, so that we can allow sort of much more, so that the buyer can just know if they want to, when there's the uncertainty is 50% of the baseline or 10% or 100% of the baseline, just sort of a simple statistic that gives, and that would also, you would want to know some notion about the bias, but we would, could correct for that accordingly and crediting. And so I think I'll just close by saying that the standardization remains crucial. The change in methodologies gets us toward quality, but what the buyer still needs to know is that they're not going to get a different answer for the project A. The issuance is 2x different because even though both people use a dynamic baseline, but they're getting different answers. And that's the problem that needs to be solved both through kind of collective action on the validation sites and the global data sets that Elias was referring to, but also on, I think also on this convergence across groups to get to a smaller set of like kind of software solutions that Elias was also mentioning, such that we've got less divergence and less noise that's ultimately confusing the buyer and scaring people away from the market.
Thank you. Christine, what do you want to communicate from your sort of perspective here?
I just want to double underline what Carlos just said, this call for standardization and transparency. I think, you know, it's unreasonable to expect that we're going to be able to eliminate risk or reduce uncertainty altogether. But what we can do is be really transparent about what risks do exist, who is holding them, what that looks like, and just be really clear about, again, defining what a dynamic baseline is and having some sort of agreed upon definition associated with that. And I think at that point, having that transparency in the marketplace will enable buyers and investors to have more confidence to finance these projects. I think right now it's just too confusing, too complex, too varied, no matter where you go, that they're reluctant to actually jump in and share some of that risk. So.
Thank you. Elias, over to you to close us out.
Yeah, I guess I would agree that like one of the big take homes from this webinar should be like we need to find standards. And my definition of standards doesn't necessarily mean like a set of rules saying this is how you have to do it, but it really is more of around a set of rules of how you assess how accurate you are and how you deduct uncertainties. And that'll enable us to continue to improve our actual methods as we also issue credits. But, you know, just as a takeaway, I mean, I get really excited about dynamic baselines because, like I said, it shifts the argument from kind of what could have happened to what would have happened. I think, as Christine pointed out, it shifts the uncertainty from kind of like going into the atmosphere to what's actually on the ground and what's being credited with. And, you know, it also, obviously, I don't know that any of us overtly stated it, but dynamic baselines allow us to take into account changes in circumstances like Bolsonaro getting kicked out of office and Lula getting into office. And that's obviously had dramatic shifts in how many credits these projects should potentially be getting because deforestation is going down. So all of these are really good, strong points in favor of dynamic baselines, which is why we get very passionate about it here at Renoster. So,
well, great. Thank you very much. Huge thanks to the panel for this conversation today, and to Catherine and Elias and the Renoster team for bringing together this conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, just round of applause. I know you can't hear it, but round of applause for our panelists and Nan for moderating. Like Nan mentioned earlier, the Q&A has been popping off with really great discussion. So encourage everybody to continue the conversation. Hopefully everyone gains some new insights. All right, great. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye.